From a forgotten village to the heart of a nation. The girl they cast out is now the voice they can't ignore. This is Zanira's story, the rise from shadows into the light. The rain had always come suddenly in Makoro. One moment the sun would dazzle so fiercely that the dust from the cracked earth spun into the air like tiny golden spirits. The next clouds would gather dark and vengeful, pouring their sorrows across the land. But that night, the night everything changed for Zanira. The rain came not as a blessing, but as a punishment. Thunder snarled above the tin roofs. Lightning slashed across the sky, throwing the crooked streets into stark, wild relief. In a crumbling house near the edge of town, Zanira cowered under the dripping doorway, her small hands clutching a worn cloth bag against her chest. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead. Her thin shoulders shook with every angry roar of the sky. Inside the house, Mamik, her stepmother, loomed like a shadow, made flesh. Her voice, sharp, bitter, and loud enough to slice through the storm cut into Zanira's bones. "Out!" Mamik spat, her arms swinging wildly to point at the door. "You're nothing but a curse, a mouth too many to feed. You should thank me for keeping you this long." Zanira's lips quivered, but no words came. She wanted to plead, to explain, to remind Mamik of promises once made to her dying father. But she knew better. Words meant nothing in Mamik's house. The heavy door slammed behind her, leaving Zanira alone with the storm. The rain struck her like whips. Mud oozed between her bare toes. She staggered into the night, clutching the only possessions she had. A cracked photograph of her father, a faded shawl that had once smelled like home, and a heart full of questions no one would ever answer. Makoro shrank behind her with every shivering step. The lights of the town flickered like weak candles in the distance before vanishing entirely into the curtain of rain. And so began Zanira's journey. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to keep moving, away from Mamik, away from the cruel words and colder stares. She walked until her legs screamed and her lungs burned from the wet air. The night swallowed her whole. At the outskirts of Makoro, she found a broken cart toppled by the side of the road, its wheels tilted at useless angles, its covering ripped and hanging like tired flags. Shivering uncontrollably, Zanira crawled beneath it. It wasn't much, but it was something. A thin shield against the fury of the night. Curled into a tight ball, Zanira sang to herself, a soft, trembling tune. It was a song her father used to hum when the nights were too long, when monsters real or imagined seemed to prowl just beyond the firelight. She sang not for comfort, but for remembrance. Above her, the rain sang back in a language she almost understood, a song of endings and beginnings, of grief and fierce, stubborn hope. By the time the sun's pale fingers crept across the horizon, the storm had emptied itself. Makoro was miles behind and ahead. Somewhere beyond the endless fields and broken fences was Bura City, the place of dreams and dangers whispered about in the markets. Zanira set out again, driven by a hope she didn't dare name. Bura City did not welcome her with open arms. It roared and bustled and gleamed, dazzling and cruel. Skyscrapers like steel gods pierced the sky. People moved quickly. Their faces set, their eyes sliding past Zanira as if she were invisible. She wandered through the maze of streets, wide-eyed and bewildered, until the sights and sounds battered her into exhaustion. By midday, hunger gnawed at her belly like a trapped animal. She stumbled toward the edges of a bustling market, where the scent of frying meat and fresh bread tortured her. Around the food stalls, workers shouted orders, chefs flipped sizzling pans, and customers jostled with overflowing baskets. Zanira hovered at the edges, too ashamed to beg, too desperate to leave. That's when she met Babachilo. He was an old man with a belly like a small mountain and eyes like warm coals. His food cart, a battered thing painted bright blue, stood apart from the others, its sign boasting proudly, "Babachilo's Best." He caught sight of her peeking around the corner, her ribs outlined too sharply beneath her soaked dress. "Little bird, He called out in a voice rough as gravel, but gentle as a lullaby. "Come here." Zanira froze. She looked left, right, sure he meant someone else. But Babachilo beckoned with a huge hand. "Come on now, no one should look that hungry." Timidly, she approached. He handed her a warm piece of fried bread wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth. "No charge," he said, when she tried to mumble thanks. "Just remember, kindness is a seed. Plant it when you can." Tears threatened, but she blinked them back fiercely. She devoured the bread in 3 grateful bites, savoring every crumb. Babachilo didn't press her with questions. He didn't ask why she was alone, or why her clothes were too thin, or why her eyes were too old for her young face. He simply let her sit by his cart, handing her small scraps now and then, when the crowd thinned. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zanira allowed herself to exhale. That afternoon, as the market buzzed and the city rumbled around her, Zanira did what she had always done when the world became too big, too loud. She sang. She thought no one was listening. She tucked herself behind the food stalls, invisible as ever, and let her voice slip free in a soft, secret hum. The song started as a whisper, barely louder than the heartbeat in her chest. It was a melody without words, woven from longing and memory, stitched together from every moment she had ever loved and lost. Her voice floated on the warm air, weaving between the smells of spices and smoke, curling into the clamor of the market without disturbing it like a ghost. No one could see, but someone heard. Titi never knew what made her turn her head at that exact moment. She had been rushing through the market late again, clutching a clipboard covered in frantic notes. As a junior producer at Bura Television Network, she was constantly racing deadlines, scouting locations, chasing after elusive talents who always slipped through her fingers. She almost missed it, the fragile thread of music that tugged at her heart like an unseen hand. She stopped dead in her tracks. The world around her, the shouting vendors, the clang of pots, the honking taxis blurred into a distant roar. Only the music remained. Titi spun around, searching for the source. There behind the stalls, half hidden by a tangle of baskets and crates, she saw her, a tiny figure curled into herself, singing to no one, singing everything. The girl's eyes were closed. She looked so lost, so heartbreakingly alone, and yet in that moment, she was more alive than anything else in the city. Titi felt the hair on her arms rise. She had heard countless voices before, powerful singers, polished performers, but this was something raw and wild and real. It was the sound of a soul speaking without permission or pretense. She took a step closer, hardly daring to breathe. Zanira didn't notice her. She kept humming the notes, dancing softly from her lips, full of pain and love and memories too big for her young heart. Titi stood there, her breath caught in her chest, listening to the last delicate notes from the girl's lips. Around her, the market bustled, vendors shouting, carts rattling, children laughing. But to Titi, the world had narrowed to this moment, this sound. She had heard talent before. She had traveled across dusty villages and crowded cities hunting for it. But this was different. This wasn't just a voice. It was a story, a wound, a prayer. Titi took a cautious step forward. The girl, barely more than a child, shrank back instinctively, her fingers tightening around the frayed edge of her shawl. "Hey," Titi said, her voice gentle. "Don't be afraid." Zanira stared at her with wide, wary eyes, the eyes of someone who had been hurt too many times to trust easily. "You were humming," Titi continued, crouching slightly to seem less intimidating. "It was beautiful, really beautiful." Zanira said nothing. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Titi smiled reassuringly. Would you sing it again? Properly this time?" The girl hesitated, her body trembling as if the very idea of being noticed terrified her. Her gaze darted left and right as if searching for an escape route. "I won't hurt you," Titi promised softly. I think you have something very special. I want to hear it." For a long moment, it seemed Zanira would bolt, but then something shifted. Maybe it was the hunger for kindness in Titi's eyes. Maybe it was the faint memory of her mother's songs whispered in the dark. Maybe it was simply that deep down, Zanira was tired of hiding. Slowly, she straightened. She drew in a shaky breath, and then she sang. At first, her voice was a whisper, fragile and uncertain. But as the melody unfolded, it gathered strength, rising like a tide. She sang the song her mother used to croon to her when she was just a baby. A lullaby woven from love and sorrow, hope and heartbreak. The market stilled. Vendors fell silent. Shoppers froze with hands halfway to their baskets. Even the restless children stopped to listen, their mouths slightly open. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath just for her. When the last note faded into the air, a heavy silence blanketed the marketplace. Titi blinked, stunned. She had found something more than just a singer. She had found a phenomenon. The girl, this trembling, broken girl, had a voice that could stop a city. Titi didn't waste a second. She scribbled her number on a scrap of paper and pressed it into Zanira's hand. "I work for Bura National TV," she explained breathlessly. "We're holding auditions for a new talent show. I want you to come." Zanira gaped at her, the paper crumpling in her fingers. Titi grinned. "You'll be amazing. Trust me." But as she hurried away, heart pounding with excitement, she knew it would not be easy. Talent was one thing. Convincing Zanira to believe in herself, that would be the real challenge. 2 days later, Zanira stood outside the glittering glass doors of Bura National TV, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure the security guards could hear it. She had never seen anything so grand. The soaring atrium, the polished marble floors, the giant posters of glamorous singers and actors smiling down at her. She clutched the hem of her borrowed dress, trying to make herself small. Invisible. "You don't belong here," a voice whispered in her head. "You're just a stray, a nobody." But then she remembered Titi's eyes, so warm, so sure, and she forced herself to take a step forward. Inside, the waiting area buzzed with nervous energy. Dozens of contestants in glittering outfits clutched microphones and water bottles, practicing scales or mumbling lyrics under their breath. Zanira slid into a corner, pulling her shawl around her like armor. Hours crawled by. At last, a voice called her name. She rose on shaking legs and followed the assistant down a long hallway, past cameras and wires and bright lights that made her squint. The audition room was massive. A panel of judges sat at a long table, clipboards in front of them, faces unreadable. A few camera operators hovered nearby, adjusting their equipment. Titi was there off to the side, giving her an encouraging nod. Zanira's mouth went dry. "Run!" The voice in her head urged, "Run now." But she didn't. Instead, she stepped up to the microphone. The judges barely glanced at her. Another kid, another dream. They had seen it all before. Then she opened her mouth, and the world shifted. She sang with all the force bottled up inside her. The years of loneliness, the nights sleeping under broken carts, the ache of missing her mother, the bruises from Mamik's cruel hands. She poured it all into the song, her voice soaring, trembling, defiant. The judges sat up straighter. The camera operators forgot to move. In the control room, technicians leaned closer to their screens. She finished with a single aching note that seemed to hang in the air forever. Silence. Then, an eruption of applause. The judges stood up. Titi clapped until her hands stung. One of the producers wiped away a tear. Zanira blinked, stunned. She had never heard applause directed at her before. Not real applause, not this. She had always been invisible, forgotten, not anymore. That night, Titi uploaded a short clip from the audition to social media. She didn't expect what happened next. Within an hour, it had 10,000 views. By morning, it had exploded to over 1 million news sites picked it up. The voice that stopped a city meet, Zanira. Hashtags flooded the internet. Golden voice. Zanira rises. Bura miracle. Famous singers reposted her video with captions like, "This gave me chills." Talk shows begged TT for interviews. Radio stations played the clip on repeat. In markets and taxis and crowded apartments across Bura City, people listened and were moved. For the first time, Zanira's voice was everywhere. For the first time, she was everywhere. The next afternoon, TT found her sitting quietly in the lobby, still wearing the same shawl, her eyes wide with disbelief. Wordlessly, TT handed her a phone. "Look," she whispered. Zanira stared at the screen. Post after post. Videos, articles, comments from strangers calling her an angel and a once-in-a-lifetime voice. Her hands trembled, her breath caught. "For the first time," TT said softly, smiling through tears. "The world sees you." Zanira pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was seen. She was heard. She mattered. And deep in her heart, something fragile and fierce began to bloom. In the village of Makoro, a battered old television flickered in the corner of a cramped living room. Mamik sat frozen in her chair, the half-washed laundry slipping from her hands. Tisa, her daughter, stood stiffly by the door, her face pale and stricken. On the screen there, she was Zanira. The girl they had thrown away like a broken doll. The girl they had mocked, cursed, beaten, and finally cast out into the storm, without a second glance. Now she sat in a glittering television studio, lights shining down on her like a blessing. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, her eyes glowing with a quiet dignity that made her seem older, wiser, unbreakable. Mamik's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She pressed her hands against her chest as if trying to hold in the sudden wild beating of her heart. Tisa sank onto the floor, clutching her knees to her chest. "Mama," she whispered, but her voice cracked under the weight of everything left unsaid. Mamik could hardly breathe. A flash of memory seared through her. That night, the storm raging, her own voice shrill with anger. Get out, you worthless girl, don't come crawling back." Zanira's small figure, drenched and trembling, stumbling away into the darkness. She had never thought about what happened after Never Cared. Now the whole world cared, and they were watching. The flashback clawed at Mamik's mind. She had always been a harsh woman, proud, bitter, quick to anger. When Zanira's mother died, leaving behind a tiny, fragile girl, Mamik had taken her in, not out of love, but out of duty and resentment. Zanira had been a burden, another mouth to feed, another reminder of dreams crushed by poverty and hard living. She never smiled at the girl, never told her she was loved, only scolded, only slapped, only sneered. And when the girl had grown too quiet, too timid, Mamik had convinced herself it was Zanira's fault. The night she threw her out there had been no hesitation, no guilt. Now, sitting in front of the flickering television, guilt washed over her like a flood she could not outrun. The neighbors were already whispering. Old women in colorful scarves shook their heads at the market stalls. Children whispered cruel stories behind cupped hands. "Isn't that Mamik's girl on TV? Didn't they say she was no good? A curse. Looks like she was the only good thing to ever come out of that house." Mamik gritted her teeth against the rising tide of shame. "No one knows the full story," she muttered under her breath. "No one knows how difficult she was. Always sick, always slow." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they rang hollow. Tisa stared at her mother with something between horror and pity. "They're not stupid, Mama," she said quietly. "They know what happened." Mamik slapped her hand against the table, making Tisa flinch. "It wasn't my fault I did what I had to do. She wasn't strong enough for this world." But even Tisa was no longer convinced. The truth was spreading like wildfire, and there was no burying it now. Meanwhile, in the heart of Bura City, Zanira sat under the dazzling lights of the national TV studio, facing the cameras with a calm she barely recognized as her own. The interviewer, a polished man in an expensive suit, leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Zanira," he said, "you have become a sensation overnight. Millions of people are inspired by your story, but many don't know where you came from. Would you be willing to share your journey? Zanira hesitated for a fraction of a second. The memories were heavy, sharp-edged things, dangerous to handle. But she nodded. She had been silent long enough. She would not hide anymore. She would not be ashamed of surviving. I was born in a village called Makoro. She began, her voice steady but soft. It's small, poor forgotten, just like I was. A ripple went through the audience. I lost my mother when I was very young, she continued. After that life was hard, I was taken in by relatives who didn't really want me. I was made to feel like a burden, like a mistake. The interviewer's brow furrowed sympathetically. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion on her face. They told me I was nothing, Zanira said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A burden, a mistake, and one night in... She paused. Her throat tightened, but she pushed through. One night, in the middle of a storm, they threw me out. Gasps rippled through the studio. I wandered for hours, soaked and freezing. I thought I would die out there, but somehow I didn't. I slept under broken carts. I begged for scraps. Her voice did not tremble. It rang out clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. But even then, I kept singing. I sang to myself, to the stars, to the memories of my mother. I sang because it reminded me that I was still alive, that I still mattered even if no one else thought so. A single tear slipped down her cheek. The interviewer leaned closer, moved beyond words. And now, Zanira said, her voice growing stronger, I stand here not because I'm special, but because I refuse to let their hatred define me, because someone, one person, heard me and believed in me. She turned her eyes seeking Titi in the wings and smiled. And because deep down, even in the worst moments, I believed that my life could be more than just survival. The audience erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. Across the country, televisions and phones lit up with her words. She wasn't just a girl with a golden voice. She was a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope. In Makoro, Mamik sat rigidly in her chair, the tear-streaked screen reflecting her haggard face. Tisa whispered, Maybe we should find her? Apologize? Mamik said nothing. Deep inside, she knew no apology would ever be enough. Back in the studio, as the applause died down, Zanira sat quietly, her heart pounding, but light. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had told her story. All of it. The ugly parts. The painful parts. The parts that no one had wanted to see. And the world had listened. The interviewer leaned forward again, his voice almost reverent. Zanira, he asked, if you could tell your younger self, that scared abandoned girl in the storm, anything, what would it be? Zanira smiled, a bittersweet smile full of all the sorrow and strength she carried. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice soft but unshakable. I would tell her, she began, her eyes shining, that no one else gets to decide your worth, that your scars are proof you survived, that one day you'll stand in the light, and that you were never, ever a mistake. The audience rose to their feet, clapping wildly, some openly sobbing. And with that, Zanira's journey had only just begun. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of Zanira's incredible journey. Her story reminds us that no matter how deep the darkness, there's always a light waiting to be found. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales of hope and resilience. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts and feelings about Zanira's story in the comments below. Your voice matters just like hers.